So I'm going to start with a poem, Ji Ayanu. And since there's enough Punjabi speakers, I think, in the audience, I'll read it in Punjabi, not in English, so the people who don't understand Punjabi can look at the English. मैं अक्सर गल्लां करदा हां गा नाल दरख्तां नाल ते दरिया नाल कदे नहीं किहा उन्हां मेरे इत्थे आना खुशामदीद नहीं मैं हवा दे पत्तियां नाल तबसरा करदियां सुनिया है निकवी इशारा नफरत दा नहीं मींह अते बर्फ मेरे दोस्तां दी तरह मूदियां ते स्पर्श नहीं करदे हर सवेर पंछी आउंदे हन मेरे घर दी पारी थले गीत गाउंदे हन नवे दिन लई नवी जगह ते जी आयां आखदे हन उन्हां नूं क्यों नहीं सी पुछया गया जदों मेरे कामागाता मारू नूं वापस भेजण दा कीता गया सी फैसला. So with this poem, we see words of remembrance for the Komagata Maru, which is why we're all here together, and which Satwinder has given us such a beautiful narration, tragic narration of what happened. And we know this quote as well, which Satwinder just shared with us. So as Satwinder has discussed, this was policy at the highest levels of Canadian society. And that is something that's hard for some today to recognize, even as today significant changes are being enacted in current immigration policy that mirror the kinds of policies that excluded the Komagata Maru. Ali Ghazmi's brilliant film expresses this beautifully, the connections between then and now, and we of course have discussed the presentistness of this story, how much it resonates with today. So here I'm going to get to this idea of whiteness, actually, that Ali had brought up, and he kind of stole my thunder a little bit, but that's okay. Anti-immigrant sentiment, of course, has a long history in North America. It was directed in the strongest terms against Germans and the Irish just a few decades before the arrival of the Komagata Maru. This is one that's a personal favorite of mine among anti-Irish propaganda, because, of course, my name is Murphy. It was extremely common at that time, in the late 19th century, to see such othering depictions of the Irish, where they're portrayed as less than human, bearing simian features, and not equal to Anglo-Saxon whites. So racialization, therefore, took numerous forms, and whiteness itself has been produced through a series of complex exclusions and inclusions at the same time. This idea of the production of monolithic whiteness is something I want to call attention to in general, because it's relevant to the theatrical works that I'm going to discuss here today, and the critique that they engage in relation to the Komagata Maru. It was indeed the awareness of the dangerously shifting nature of racialized discourses that was apparent in media at the time. So in this 1882 cartoon, the German figure says to the, again, kind of ape-like looking Irish figure, that if the Yankee Congress can keep the yellow man out, what is to hinder them from calling us green and keeping us out too? We often forget this when we look at the past, that the categories we think of as given applied in different ways in a different time. This is perhaps why historical inquiry is in itself so important, to attempt to enter into that time and understand the categories, sentiments, and choices that were possible and livable in that time. My point here is not to deny that early 20th century immigration policy was overtly racist. It was, and it was so by design. The point here is to note, too fast, is to note that the racialization that determined the fate of the Komagata Maru operated not just as a result of, but also in the interests of building that monolithic whiteness, as we saw expressed in Mackenzie King's quote. And of course this was no fringe view, right? Because he was Prime Minister of Canada from 1921 to 1930 and 1935 to 1948. So this was a national project as well. So through such exclusions, whiteness itself was formed and legislated and enforced. So we see both things happening at the same time, a kind of complex set of inclusions and exclusions, and of course that being organized in 1914 around the Komagata Maru. So these are the architects of that construction, of what it means to be included and what it means to be excluded, the mechanics of that policy that excluded the Komagata Maru, H.H. Stevens at the center, Conservative MP from Vancouver, Malcolm Reed, a political appointee. You know all this because you've seen Ali Kazmi's film, so I won't go into the details of it. But if we were to consider not just life, but also history a stage, these are the kinds of characters who are central to that production. If we to try and enter into that world, as I said earlier, if to try and understand the past is to try and enter a different world, in a way we can think of history as something like a performance that we can enter into. And these are the passengers of the Komagata Maru, the humans whose lives are so adversely impacted by government policies and intrigue. These archival images represent what we can know about the Komagata Maru in its own time. The voices of the passengers are largely silent in the archives of the state, and Linda was bringing out some of the voices that do exist upon that proscenium of the stage of history writing. Today I'd like to suggest that every event exists, as the oral historian Alexander Portelli has argued, in dynamic form within the living memory of communities, and in that way is constantly recreated and relived. There is a historical past that does matter, so this is not an anti-history argument, just in case you're wondering. It does matter what happened, because without the ability to tell something approaching a true story of the past, all our memories are fiction. It is crucial we not forget that historical reality of the Canadian past, to prevent this denial, and to recognize the truth of past injustices and how they resonate with the present. Okay, so that there is a connection to the present. And we have people sitting in this room, again, to mention Hugh Johnston, who's of course here, Ali Kazmi, and others, whose work is so crucial in addressing what actually happened in the many, many different kinds of sources and documents we have from the past. And although I have written in that vein, that's not my intent today. At the same time, I'm interested in understanding how and why memories work too. To understand the history both as a representation of the past and as a continuing performance. So that's what I'm focusing on today. So May 2014 marked the centenary of the Komagata Maru's arrival in Canada, and then in July its deportation to India. And it has received, as you know, I'm sure, a lot of attention. In BC, there were a lot of activities surrounding the centenary. There was a digital archive project at Simon Fraser University Library, an exhibition of contemporary works related to and reflecting on the history of the Komagata Maru, which Ali Kazmi did a beautiful contribution. And a welcome ceremony was organized by the Musqueam people to symbolize the welcome that should have awaited the Komagata Maru upon its arrival a century earlier. But what does the Komagata Maru mean today, and what does it mean to remember the Komagata Maru over time? So that's really my central question today. So my focus is on three theatrical representations of the Komagata Maru incident. The Komagata Maru incident by Sharon Pollock, published in 1976, and also performed. The Komagata Maru by Ajmer Rode, which was published in 1984 but was completed and performed in 1979. And Samundari Sher Nal Takkar by Sadhu Binning and Sukhwant Hundal, which was published in 1989 and actually was never performed. And so we performed parts of it, and that was the first time it was actually performed. So throughout this discussion today, I'm going to show scenes from a production that I worked on with others at UBC, where we produced a single program that included sections from each of these three plays. It was very much of an experimental project to take parts of three plays and somehow knit them together into one production. We wanted somehow to share all the works with the Vancouver audience, to examine how the Komagata Maru has been remembered by different individuals, different Canadians over time and in different languages. And we wanted to cross linguistic and community boundaries that might otherwise isolate the plays from one another. So that is to say, we've guessed that if we staged readings or even full performances of the three plays in isolation, most Punjabi speakers would go to the Punjabi language plays, most Anglophones would go to the English language play, and there would be some, mostly Punjabi heritage individuals who would be able to understand both, who might go to both plays. but we would not be able to bring all of the kind of audiences together. So we were trying to subvert that and cross linguistic and also racialized lines and enable engagement with the incident across those lines. So we decided to build this program that would combine parts of each of the plays and produce one single program that would be fully bilingual through the use of surtitling. So every time English was used, Punjabi was projected. Every time Punjabi was used, English was projected. With the support of a small UBC internal grant, and then a tiny Surrey Arts grant, and even tinier Kwantlen Polytechnic University grant, we commenced. I wrote the script, and the Punjabi language sections were performed by Rangmanch Punjabi Theatre, a young new theatre group based in Surrey, and were directed by Rupinder Sharma. The UBC Theatre and Film Department was our partner at UBC, and more supportive than anyone else I've ever experienced at UBC. They were really into it, and that was really exciting for me personally. Their students performed the sections of the English language play under the direction of Catherine Dubourg, who was an MFA student in their department. The narration, that script that I wrote, knitting the plays together, was performed by myself and Ranbir Jol of Kwantlen Polytechnic University, and then Rana Nair of Punjab University, but then he had to go back to India early because his mother became very ill. So then Sukhwant Hundal, one of the playwrights, filled in for him. The sets were designed by Raghavendra Rao, KV, and his students at Srishti School of Art, Design and Technology in Bangalore. And we had an exhibition in November of last year of the elements of the sets, and also works of arts by the students responding to the story of the Komagata Maru. So as Sharon Pollock noted with reference to her play, as a Canadian I feel that much of our history has been misrepresented and even hidden from us. Until we can recognize our past, we cannot change our future. So the first thing I want to do is kind of place these plays in a larger Canadian national imaginary, and so we can get kind of a sense of where they sit historically. So the dates of the plays are 1976, 1984, but performed earlier in 1979 and then 1989. And we can see that there's a change happening in Canadian society that corresponds, so these plays kind of reflect a kind of growing ability to reflect upon the exclusions that have formed Canadian society and a different orientation towards race in particular. So race is taken out of the Immigration Act in 1967. Trudeau declares multiculturalism as a policy in Canada. The Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedom recognizes multiculturalism in 1982, and the Multiculturalism Act was actually passed by Congress in 1988. So we can see in some ways an opening up happening here that in some ways really corresponds to the production of these plays. The Punjabi plays also function in a broader transnational history that must impinge on our understanding of where they sit in the world. So we can also add to this list of events two of great importance. 1984, of course, Operation Blue Star and the anti-Sikh violence pogrom in Delhi and other urban centers in India, and the Air India bombing, which of course was very important locally in Vancouver. So the plays, the Punjabi plays in this way demonstrate efforts by the authors to pull attention to the history and experience of the Canadian community, actually away from, in some ways, these transnational interests, and to call attention to the social problems taking place in Canada, both in the larger community and in their other work in the Punjabi Canadian community. So there's the work of Punjabi writers in the 70s and 80s, both highlighted racism, but also a lot of the kinds of internal problems in the community, casteism, violence against women, etc. In this way, they're parallel to other efforts to relocate the interests of the community. This is probably most vividly demonstrated in Vancouver in literary terms in the renaming that occurs with reference to the journal Watan Dur, Far from the Homeland, which was founded in 1973 in Greater Vancouver and published until 1986. After the journal closed, it was revived under a new name, Watan. which continued until 1995 and now has been brought back to life again as an online magazine. The Homeland, in this way, was brought home to Canada and fully enabled to do so by the internet. Sado Binning noted in the symposium associated with the production we did that he co-authored his play with Hundal, quote, out of anger. He had, in 1989, finally decided to call himself Canadian, and he was angry about the sense of exclusion he experienced within that decision, having made that decision and feeling that he was excluded from even being able to make it and feel it as his own. So Hundal, expanding on Binning's words, described their effort as resulting from, I'm quoting him here, being tired of explaining ourselves. We wanted to turn the lens onto white people and stop telling them about us. So in a few minutes I'm going to turn to the specifics of the play and also our own productions and the themes that I developed our script around. In the next few minutes. I have, how much time do I have? What am I doing? Okay, I'll hurry up. Okay, so these three plays in many ways can be seen as instantiations of a broader conversation about the significance of the Komagata Maru incident and what it represents in the history of Canada. So they're kind of like a performance of community memory. They're distinctive in their approach to the incident and yet intersect in important ways. That's what we try to draw out in the production. We see in all plays, for instance, the elaboration of the imagined dialogues among the racist white Canadian officials, arguments about the status of the passengers on the ship and their lesser humanity. In Binning and Hundal's work, this emphasis is exclusive. We see only one Punjabi character, very briefly, the community leader Sohandal, who speaks only one line. Otherwise, the Punjabi passengers exist as phantoms. They're completely silenced, again suggesting this idea of complete exclusion. So in that way, the voice of racist Canada prevails, except in one way. The title of the play, Samundari Sher Nal Takkar, refers to an attempt by the Vancouver police to board the ship and their failure to do so due to the resistance of the passengers. So even though the play kind of enacts silencing, it also portrays this heroic moment in this otherwise tragic tale. On the other hand, Pollock and Rode both imagine the voices of Punjabis on the ships, and in the case of Rode, also on the shore. In Rode's play, he gives us great detail about what's happening on the shore, the efforts of the members of the shore committee to help the passengers, the efforts of the passengers to confront racist Canadian policy. Interestingly, both Pollock and Rode feature a single woman speaker on the ship, a kind of high moral commentary upon what is happening. This single woman stands in for all the passengers as a group. She describes their hope and disappointment and their suffering during the excruciating 2-month wait on the ship in the harbor. It's the only Punjabi voice in Pollock's play, and it calls everything into question. In Rode's play, we also hear other unnamed kind of ethereal voices that intervene in the play, calling again for a moral accounting of what transpired. Our production sought to call attention to these commonalities and distinctions to create a conversation about the Komagata Maru across the plays, and across, as I said, languages and theatrical traditions, integrating the Punjabi works with the English language work through this bilingual program. So here we have Sukhwant Hundal, and thank you to Ali Kazmi for all the photographs, which he did a beautiful job with. Thank you. So we were the narrators for the play, and here's Sukhwant Hundal narrating against the backdrop. So I want to highlight 3 themes here that were of particular importance before I end. One was the ongoing presence of the past. As a way to call attention to the ways in which the Komagata Maru incident persists in the present within the lives of Punjabi Canadians, Rode's play opens with an exchange between a young woman and an old man who's looking for the 2nd Avenue Gurdwara, the historical center of the South Asian community in Vancouver, before it was sold and the Gurdwara was moved to southern Vancouver. This is the scene where we have their meeting. So the young woman, "Sir, have you lost your way?" "No, I'm trying to find the Sikh temple that was here. Do you know where it is?" Here we learn that this old man was a passenger on the Komagata Maru and that he has come to pay homage to the place where all the Hindustanis in Vancouver gathered to support the passengers. He learns that the 2nd Avenue Gurdwara was sold and an apartment now stands in its place. A plaque was just actually put on the site last year. The scene acts as a call on the Punjabi Canadian community to remember its history, and it is a theme with which we started our production. The second theme that I want to highlight is this idea of the female voice as critique. This is achieved by Rodet and Pollock by the creation of female characters in an attempt to imagine what Ajmer Rodet has described, quote, what must have been there, even though we don't know that side of the history. So as in both plays, as I mentioned, a woman stands for the ship with her child, and there were women on the ship with children, so that is at least emanating out of the historical record. Here is that figure in the play, and she speaks in the beginning of the play and she speaks at the end. We carried her character through the production, the same actor in both the English play and the Punjabi play, so she was the only actor who performed in both Punjabi and in English. And there are 2 white women who are introduced as characters as well, to offset the kind of white male racist voice in the form of William Hopkinson, who was kind of the quintessential white male voice in both plays. Pollock's play, pictured here, takes place in a brothel, symbolic of the bankrupt nature of the state in its treatment of the Komagata Maru. Evie is its proprietor, with the red cape in the image. She questions Hopkinson's attitudes toward the ship and its passengers, and she opposes him with increasing urgency. In one exchange, she asserts the bankrupt nature of his work, its immoral character. Don't you like honest work? That's a funny remark from a whore. You want to know why I threw out your note? Because a note had been left for him by his Punjabi informant, and she threw it out. And she says, I'll tell you why. I'm a whore, and what you do is offensive to me. What you do would gag me. I'm a whore, and when I look at your job, I could vomit. In another scene, Evie is witness to an act of racial violence, and she articulates the moral failure that occurs when she stands by and does nothing in the face of that violence. I should have done something. You should have come home and you did. Come on now, you saw a fight. You've seen fights before. No, it wasn't a fight. A man is attacked by a group of men. The final, 40 minutes, 5 minutes?
No.
Okay, the other one.
5 minutes.
Gotcha, okay. I'll break it. So there are people at the end of Burrard staring at that ship. They look like the men in that line. And then, she says at the end, Hopkinson says, all I know, Evie, is my father didn't die in the service for the world to be overrun by second-rate people. You don't make sense. Who's second-rate when you run out of brown people? Similarly, Rodet's play positions Jean, a secretary in the immigration office, as a counterpoint to Hopkinson, questioning him in a similar vein. Just listen to me, when the Hindus started coming here 8 to 10 years ago, everyone started to worry, if the Hindus keep coming, our Canada will be full of them in no time, and we white folks will get squeezed out. You mean the same way the native people here were squeezed out when we came? Yes? No. The white race is superior. And then she ends, I don't agree with you, but go on. Here we see the mention of the First Nations, the specter that haunts everything happening in 1914 and still today in Vancouver. Here the new voices injected into the historical record complicate and oppose. They show us the possibility of layers of opinion among white Canadians, a position that an audience today can perhaps accept or inhabit. These voices recall the plight of the First Nations, who had themselves borne the brunt of white supremacist power. Jean's voice becomes more strident by the end of the play, a kind of gift perhaps that Rodet gives to his Punjabi-speaking audience, a way to imagine an alternative white position, perhaps. The third theme I want to highlight is called Turning the Lens Back, as suggested by Sukhwant Hundal, and as seen with the creation of the white characters who critique white supremacy and exclusion. As Craig Walker has noted in his discussion of Sharon Pollock's work, she appeals, quoting him here, to our common personal experience and social ethics, to our willingness to project ourselves into the circumstances of the plays. Pollock has noted that she explored white experiences and conversations because, as a white person, she felt this was appropriate, Someone else, she said, needed to come and tell the story for Punjabis. Yet all the three plays examined here explore the contradictions imminent to whiteness itself in British Columbia in 1914, and I think this is one crucial political intervention that they make. So here we see figures like Edward Byrd, who fights in court on behalf of the passengers. So this attempt to portray the fact that there was actual diversity of opinion among whites, even though the overwhelming kind of force of the time was very much against Asian immigration. In Hundalan Binning's play, this is made comical, this turning back of the lens, and this highlighting of the complex and contradictory nature of white society. For example, in this unfortunately kind of blurry photograph, sorry about that, we can see one of the recruits for an ad hoc militia formed to force the Komagata Maru out of Vancouver Harbor. Now they fail in their attack, right? They try to force the Komagata Maru to leave, but they are forced out. The recruit that is portrayed here is described as follows. Here we have before you Mr. Bruce Hutton, our first recruit for the Special Force. Height, 5 foot 10.5 inches, weight 150 pounds, unemployed for the last 6 months, residence the city parks. His passion is to drink as much and as often as possible. So they just mock the entire project itself, actually, and whiteness as being constructed. Pollock and Rodet explore these contradictions as imminent to Canada itself, at the center of the Constitution of the nation and at the center of William Hopkinson. So he's presented in both of the plays as being half Hindustani. And so his hatred is portrayed as a kind of hatred of his own self. Jean and Hopkinson, and Evie and Hopkinson. These two relationships mirror each other in the two plays. And here we have the two Hopkinsons flanked by their two female interlocutors, with the rest of the cast behind them. The Punjabi and English plays also act kind of as mirrors of each other, refracting different images of the Komagata Maru through time and across languages. In our performance, we played on this mirroring to demonstrate the parallel interventions of these playwrights in the representation of the Komagata Maru. Almost done. Understanding how and why memories work is as important for understanding both the past and present as historical inquiry is, although history itself as a discipline still matters. How to say that? The imaginative act of calling the past into the present is productive of many different pasts and many different presents. This is indeed what Sadhu Binning's poem, Ji Ayanu, or Welcome, at the opening of this talk, demonstrates so vividly. The poet's past is tied to the present, and the landscape of British Columbia provides a link that crosses time and creates personal connections across time. It is this landscape, enlivened by the elements within it that welcome him to it, which he shared with the Komagata Maru. His creative work gives him ownership today over that past and over that ship. Jadon mere Komagata Maru nu wapis bejanda kita gaya si faisla, when the decision was made to send my Komagata Maru away. The imaginative act of calling the past into the present, as these brief examples from the play indicate, is productive of many different pasts and many different presents. History, I think, in this way can be shown in a new light, and through our production we attempted to invite a new range of audiences to experience the incident and its significance in evolving terms and across languages. So we did have largely bilingual audiences in all the performances. Walker has noted that the overall concern of Pollock in her work has, I'm quoting here, to do with the difficulty of establishing truth, and hence an integrated self, in circumstances where personal agency is badly corrupted by the insidious and ubiquitous systems of social power and by self-serving distortions of reality. And I think this is exactly what all three plays attempt to display. When we look at the three plays, it may be the call to whites to challenge racism, so vividly portrayed by Pollock's Evie in her witnessing and failure to counter racial violence, and the call to Punjabis, whites, and everyone to complicate the seeming monolith of white supremacist exclusion as provided in distinct ways in the three plays, that represent for me the enduring political intervention of these plays in the making of our present. It's all too easy to let ourselves, no matter who we are, off the hook. for whites to say, I'm not racist personally, and then sit back comfortably and not challenge the forms of racism and other kinds of exclusion that persist in our society before us. And of course, that works for caste and other forms of exclusion. This is what's so striking in that scene with Evie, where she's a silent witness to violence. At the same time, it's also all too easy for all to accept those exclusionary voices as representative of all for whom those voices claim to speak. In doing so, we give them far too much, and we also, in the end, only serve the interests of exclusion. Thank you.